Hello, everyone. I think we're finally coming in good because sometimes this thing likes to give me issues. But we are in for this week's video, and of course, Memorial Day just wrapped up, so I figured I have free time on my hands. Let's get it done early. So, for this week's video, I wanted to take a look at a topic that is it's in relation to one that we have covered before, but it's also one that, because of the earlier topic, gets kind of, in the modern historical perspective, very much looked over and not given much attention. And it should be afforded attention because it's actually quite significant in world history. And that would be that of the Haitian Revolution. Now, the Haitian Revolution gets very commonly overshadowed by the French Revolution that was happening in France at the same time, mostly because Haiti was a French colony at the time. It got its independence from France. And the Haitian Revolution, it does get overlooked, but at the same time, it's very significant in world history. Because of two main reasons primarily. First, the United States was the first nation to gain independence in the Western Hemisphere. We were the first nation to formally gain independence from a European power in the Western Hemisphere back in I'll say 1776 because that's when we declared it, but technically Britain didn't recognize it until 1783. But either way, we were the first in the Western Hemisphere. Most people are surprised to learn that the second nation that followed the United States in the Western Hemisphere by breaking away from European power and declaring independence was actually Haiti. Haiti was the second nation to be created from a European colony. And the reason that Haiti is also significant is because it is the only instance in world history, not just American history, not just the history of the Americas or colonization, it is the only instance in world history where there was a successful slave rebellion. That is what spawned the Haitian Revolution. It was a rebellion primarily by former enslaved Africans that were working in the French colony that overthrew the ruling Europeans and established their own nation state. And that is the only instance. There have been many slave rebellions throughout history, but this is the only one that succeeded so far as to actually create a whole nation out of it. And that was something that also kind of hindered Haiti's relations with other nations at the time because of due to racist aspects and the prospect that slavery was still kind of a thing in most other countries, and they weren't all that keen about recognizing a breakaway slave state, pretty much, that had seen a slave rebellion and slaves take power. And we'll get to that at the very end. But for the Haitian Revolution, in order to go through this, we're going to kind of first take a look at the history of colonial life on the island of Haiti, or as the French called it, Saint Domingue, or Saint Domingue, I think. I think it was Saint Domingue. I don't think they use a Q. Saint Domingue. And before that, it had been the Spanish colony. But we'll go a little bit here into the colonial history of what Haiti experienced. It's kind of sad nowadays, considering that as of right now, Haiti is pretty much overrun by gangs. I believe, I keep seeing in the news that the gangs have completely overrun the capital and are pretty much in control of the country. And perhaps one day we'll do another video on the factor of how did Haiti get to this point? How did it break away from European power to get to this point where it is one of the worst nations on earth to live in right now because of the quality of life? Maybe we'll do that another time. That might be a very interesting topic video to look at, is how does Haiti go from getting independent to being literally a backwater country? How does that happen? So we'll start off with a little bit of colonial history. And for those of you who, I presumed everyone would know where Haiti is, but just in case we have that odd person out there that doesn't know geography all that well, and believe me, there are many, you're not alone. Haiti is right here. Here's the United States. Here's Florida. And right here, this is the island of Hispaniola. It's split into two countries. On the eastern half, we have the country of the Dominican Republic, which was a Spanish colony back in the day. Originally, all this island was Spanish. And then right here on the western side of the island, this is Haiti. This is where Haiti is. So this is where we're talking about. Is this half of the island right here is what we're discussing. Right in the squat middle of the Caribbean. So what happens is Haiti is colonized pretty early. The island itself of Hispaniola, which Haiti is located on, is located almost as soon as the Europeans come over here. It was discovered by Christopher Columbus after he came over here on his very first trip when he discovered San Salvador and thought he had landed in India. And shortly after leaving San Salvador and making his initial landing, Christopher Columbus, in December, so about 2 months afterwards, so this was December of 1492, he sighted a new island to the west, which now we know was Hispaniola. He named it, and Christopher Columbus is actually the one who gave the island its name. Initially, he called it La Española, which was the Spanish name for it, but it has been anglicized to an English name of Hispaniola, which the name literally translates to the Spanish island, is what it translates to. When Columbus landed on Hispaniola, he enslaved the native Taino people and the Chiboney peoples that will live there. These were the Native Americans, as you should say. These were the native peoples that were living on the island. He enslaved these people and forced them to mine for gold, which the Spanish were very much after, in some of the most brutal conditions and diseases possible. They got no breaks. They were worked till exhaustion. If they didn't work, they would be killed. And of course, European diseases come over with these colonists, and it spreads among the Native Americans there who have absolutely no immunity to these diseases, which have never been on the American continent before. So it kills many of them. Most of the native peoples, most of the native Taino and Chiboney peoples had died out by the late 16th century. So by the end of the 1500s, the initial source of slave labor on the island of Hispaniola is now wiped out due to disease and starvation and brutal working conditions. That leaves the Spanish in a dilemma, because now their cheap labor force is now gone. So what are we going to do to replace it? We're going to bring in slaves. We're going to bring in slaves from Africa, and only after the native peoples pretty much die out on the island do they start bringing over the slaves from Africa through the slave trade. So once the gold mines were exhausted on Hispaniola, because eventually you're going to run out of gold. The gold's not infinite. So eventually the gold mines run out. The Spanish can't get any more gold out of them. They argue that, okay, Hispaniola served its purpose. We wanted the precious metals. There's no more to be had. We don't really care what we do with the colony now. So Spain was good friends with its neighbor France, with the Kingdom of France, and it gave the western half of the island to France in 1665. It maintained control of the eastern half, which nowadays is the Dominican Republic. But the western half in 1665, they went ahead and ceded to France and gave France some territory in the Caribbean. French settlers would establish new settlements in what the French would call their half of the island, Saint Domingue, and they would establish new settlements like Port-de-Paix and Port-au-Prince, which is the capital of Haiti today. And the French West Indies Corporation would actually take control of the colony. They would take control of the main financial business on the island, which, like many other Caribbean colonies for the European nations, after the gold was gone, they turned to something else. Not cotton. Cotton was here in the United States. And here in the United States, the two main slave products, initially it was tobacco. Then the soil got overused for tobacco, wouldn't produce it anymore, and then the cotton came in. In the Caribbean, there was one key product, and it wasn't really either of these things. They did grow them, but it was not the big moneymaker. The big moneymaker in the Caribbean slave plantations was sugarcane. Sugar. That is what they were growing. And the French West Indies Corporation would take control financially of the sugarcane plantation interests in the French colony of Saint Domingue. The landowners in French Hispaniola imported massive numbers of African slaves as a result in order to work these sugarcane plantations. By 1700, there was a total of 5,000, and this is where we're going to start seeing here in 1789 a population total, and this was striking to me. This also might explain why the Haitian Revolution was primarily led by slaves, because a majority of the population was slaves. And I don't mean that in the sense that it was, 3/4. I mean like 90%. Because here is the population total in 1789, just before the Haitian Revolution breaks out. There is a total of 556,000 people living on this French colony. However, of that 556,000, 500,000 of them are slaves. only 32,000 of those 556 are actual white European colonists from France, and another 24,000 of them are what we call mulattoes. Mulattoes were people that were of mixed descent. They might have a white father or a white mother, but they might also have a Hispanic father or mother, or they would have someone that was black, someone that was African descent in their family heritage. They were a mixed race is what they were. And the mulattoes, because of that mixed parentage, although they weren't slaves, they were often disadvantaged compared to the white Europeans that were coming from France because they looked down on them racially. They said, you're still, you're a half-breed, is what they might say you were. You're a half-breed, you're half white, but you're not truly. And because of that, they don't have the same civil protections and services that an average European white colonist would get in Haiti. And of course, the slaves have no rights. The colony was renamed Saint Domingue, and Haitian society was divided based on color of your skin, on your class, and gender. The mulattoes, according to the French colonists, they used a different term. Mulatto was actually the Spanish term that came up for them, but the French called them affranchis. And they would sometimes, the mulattoes, or affranchis, as we'll try to call them here, the affranchis would sometimes own their own slaves, even though they were mixed descent themselves, but they often were much poorer and spurned by the white Europeans, as we discuss. The white Europeans often were your merchants, your landowners, overseers, craftsmen, etc., plantation, the rich upper class of the society. The enslaved Africans in Saint Domingue were the vast majority of the population and worked often on the sugarcane plantations. They could be working the fields, serve as house servants, or have to be boilermen, which would be at the sugar mills. Because if anyone is not familiar with the process of making sugar, it back then, at least, it can still be quite dangerous now. But back then, the manual labor process of refining sugarcane into actual sugar was actually quite dangerous and quite deadly. In fact, the average lifespan for a slave brought to a Caribbean sugarcane plantation was given about 6 or 7 years because of how brutal the working conditions were. Because as I've looked, sugarcane is like a grass. It's almost like a grass is what it kind of is. And they have to cut this thing off once to harvest it, and then you're crushing it to get the sugarcane juice out, and then that juice is being boiled to an extremely high temperature to crystallize the actual what will become sugar out of it. It has to be like pressure boiled, and that alone is another danger. There were many people that would work in the actual sugar mill where they would be boiling the sugarcane juice, and things would blow up. Not just to mention, this juice is extremely hot, enough that if it burns you, it could take the skin off. It was that hot. It was not something you wanted to have touched on you. So people working in the actual sugar mills that had to refine this juice into the sugar, the slaves often there suffer traumatic and significant injuries, not to mention the ones that are working out in the fields actually harvesting the sugarcane because of the need that as soon as you cut sugarcane, that juice is like it starts a timer. The timer on this sugarcane, it has to be refined and boiled as quickly as possible, or else it's going to spoil. It's like milk. You can't hold it forever. And because of that, and because of how much sugarcane there is on these plantation owners in the Caribbean, including Saint Domingue, would invent what was essentially the first 24-hour shift. The slaves would go on shifts where they were to go out in the fields and cut the sugarcane and bring it back in carts to the mills. And then another shift of slaves would come out at a different time of day and do the same thing. It was around the clock. It was a round the clock job because the sugar, as soon as you cut it, you started a timer. And of course, the plantation owner doesn't want to lose any of that sugar cane to being spoiled. He wants it all going into his pocket as money, so he needs to get it to the mill and refined as quickly and efficiently as possible. So he's getting as many slaves as he possibly can, and ensuring that they're working 24-hour shifts in order to get this sugarcane harvesting done. It was a brutal work, absolutely brutal. But this is what they were doing in the French colony of Saint Domingue. The slaves would endure these brutal working conditions. Many died from injuries, disease, as we mentioned, and malnutrition. Many of them, of course, were not fed properly. That would also prove to be a problem. Slaves who did manage to escape, as there were runaway slaves, those who did manage to escape were often known as Maroons, and they would often go and live in the mountains and actually fight guerrilla wars and battles with the local colonial militia, hoping to maybe inspire some kind of a slave uprising in the colony, which until the Haitian Revolution hadn't really occurred on a large enough scale. And to show you what that might have looked like, I do believe I have a print here of what that might have looked like, where these escaped slaves and other mulattoes would actually be up in the mountains engaging with the colonial militia before the Haitian Revolution, just trying to incite some sort of a revolt on the island, even though they weren't successful up until that point. So that brings us covers basically the colonial history of the island. Now we have come to basically the start of the Haitian Revolution, and it really happens in two phases, and this is the first phase. So the Haitian Revolution would arise from several causes. We have the affranchi frustrations with racist society, the mulattoes, as we'll also say. They are absolutely angered that despite them not being slaves, they're still disenfranchised. They're still very much at a disadvantage compared to the white European colonists. You have the French Revolution going on at home, which is putting its colonies pretty much in limbo because the French government at home has collapsed. The king is being executed. France at home is literally a revolutionary cesspool. It doesn't know what government it's going to have yet, and that leaves its overseas colonies that it still has kind of in limbo, saying, like, do we operate on our own here? Like, who do we answer to right now? That's going to cause a problem. And also the ideals of the French Revolution, of course, spread, and that's also going to inspire these revolutionaries in Haiti to take up arms. You're also going to have a nationalistic sentiment that is spread by voodoo ceremonies, or they have a different way of spelling it back then, at least the Haitian term for it, but the voodoo religion was a native religion to these slaves that had evolved from traditions out of West Africa, and it still is today. But this was a very big religion to these enslaved peoples on the island of Saint Domingue. And they use that to kind of spurn patriotism and nationalism within themselves, that, we're going to get through this. We're going to one day be able to get out of this slavery thing. And also you have the brutality of slave owners on the colony, and the wars going on in Europe that are going to start happening when the French Revolution breaks out. So in 1790, a mulatto named Vincent Auger tried to lobby the new Parisian Assembly back in Paris for colonial reforms which were denied. Basically, he wanted reforms that would give mulattoes much more equal rights in terms of what the white European colonists had in Haiti. He wanted that because he argued this is already going on at home. You guys are pretty much reforming French society at home. You're taking it away from a direct ancient regime under the old kings. This needs to happen in the colonies too. He gets utterly dejected when he makes this proposal, and he eventually leads an uprising to try to force the Parisian Assembly and the French government to comply with his demand for a reform. Unfortunately for him, he ends up being captured and then tortured and murdered in response. So and that was really the first warning, at least, that the mulattoes or the affranchis were getting very agitated with the current state of things on the colony, despite what was going on at home and these promises of, liberty and equality and fraternity for everyone. And this was not happening in the colonies. This is a warning sign in 1790 that things are kind of turning in the colonies because they want these things too, despite them not being in the homeland. In March of 1791, the French revolutionary government would grant citizenship to the wealthy affranchis to try to quiet them down. We'll say, okay, if you have this much money or if you make this much or whatever, we'll grant you citizenship. This would anger the white colonists in Saint Domingue, who pretty much, and since they were in positions of power within the colony, even though this had been issued by the French government back in Paris, the officials there, these white colonists that were in government on the colony and the colonial government, utterly refused to recognize this past law, and it didn't apply under their rule because they said, nope, we're ignoring that, we're not obeying that because we don't want to lose our own power. This would lead to fighting breaking out within 2 months by May of 1791 between the white European colonists and the affranchis, the mulattoes. In August, they were joined by a massive revolt of slaves who at this point have thrown their towel in with the affranchis. They rise up in a massive slave rebellion and laid absolute waste to the plantations of their white masters. This was Many people kind of also look over the Haitian Revolution because in many ways it gets just as violent as the French. The slaves absolutely wasted nothing, you know, destroying their masters' plantations and in some cases even murdering their masters out of the hatred and rage and anger that they felt toward these men and toward their families for keeping them imprisoned and keeping them enslaved and splitting their families up and whatsoever else. And there would be another instance of that at the very end of this revolution that we'll see, of which there was a whole massacre of white people on the island because of the factor of their perceived crimes against them when they had been slaves. And very much they were crimes. But as many cases, does violence necessarily answer with violence? That is the question. Should we answer violence with violence, or is it just going to make things worse? And the Europeans tried to appease the affranchis after the slaves start revolting in Saint Domingue in order to stop this slave rebellion. They say, "Oh, we'll give you full citizenship, no matter what your, whatever your economic position in life. We'll give you everything that you need. We're not going to question it anymore. We just want this slave rebellion put down." And the French Assembly would actually do so. They would grant a citizenship to all affranchis in April of 1792 in an effort to do this. The factions that would persist in Saint Domingue were partly because they were also supported by outside influences. Mind you, there's other nations going to war with France at this point because they are fearful of this revolutionary government in France that has overthrown monarchy, while most of the nations of Europe are monarchy. And some of the rebellious affranchis and the slaves are supported by the Spanish colonists in neighboring Santo Domingo on eastern Hispaniola, while others are being supported by the British in the south on the island of Jamaica. In 1793, a commissioner, Le Guerre Félicité Soutenau, was sent from France, and his job was to bring order and offer freedom to any slave that was currently in rebellion. If any slave would stop rebelling, lay down their arms, and join him and his army as he came to kind of bring order to the colony, they would be granted their freedom in exchange for laying down their arms. Soutenau would abolish slavery in Saint Domingue, which would be confirmed a year later in 1794 by the French General Assembly in all French colonies across the French domains. So it started in what would be Haiti. The French said, okay, we're abolishing slavery, which was quite novice because, mind you, this is 1794. The U.S. is having arguments massively just a couple years before over whether or not slaves even count as a person in the Constitution. But they're not getting rid of it. Here it is just to the south, and the French are saying, okay, we're getting rid of slavery. We're abolishing it. This isn't even the 19th century yet. It's kind of astonishing. And because Soutenau does this on the island of Saint Domingue, the French Assembly back home argues, well, if we're doing it in one place, we might as well do it entirely, and it doesn't really fit the qualities of freedom and liberty to be having enslaved labor, so let's abolish slavery throughout all of France's possessions and domains. So in 1794, partly because of events in Saint Domingue, France officially abolished, the revolutionary French government abolishes slavery, and the slaves are freed. And that is going to kind of be the first half of the French Revolution. The first, not the French Revolution, but the Haitian. The first half of it involves this rebellion by the affranchis and the enslaved Africans on the island who rise up, and they pretty much get what they want. Slavery is abolished. They're given citizenship. They're on equal terms with the white colonists who have oppressed them for many, many years. By the late 1790s, though, the situation on the island isn't 100% cool. You still have some rebels that are wanting more, and they're going to continue the fight. So there's still some conflict going on. But by the late 1790s, a former slave named Toussaint Louverture would become a prominent military leader on the island. And Toussaint would gain control of several areas, and initially he actually held the support of the French government because they saw that he's a way for us to restore order to the island and get all these under one roof. And he was a popular person among the native peoples there, at least among the mulattoes, the affranchis, and the former slaves. So he had quite the support. He would give a nominal allegiance to the French government, but he was actually pursuing his own political and military goals. For example, he was willing to negotiate with the British in order to try to get the French fully off the island, unbeknownst to them at the time. In January of 1801, Toussaint would conquer the Spanish colony of Santo Domingo in eastern Hispaniola, and in May would name himself Governor General for life. This is when the French kind of realize Louverture is maybe not going to be the tool that we want him to be, because at this point he's trying to set up his own country, pretty much is what it's looking like. He's proclaiming himself to be pretty much a dictator in name, the type that Julius Caesar did when Julius Caesar declared, "I will be dictator for life." Well, this is what Louverture does. And because of that, they rapidly kind of realize maybe this isn't going to work out with him. And they're even kind of angered by the factor that Louverture puts the peasants back to work on the plantations through military rule, which would encourage and then try to encourage French proprietors to return. So initially, it's somewhat okay. I mean, he is inviting these former rich plantation owners to come back, come back. We're putting them back to work on your plantations. We're not going to kill you. We're not going to rise up in rebellion against you. Just come back. But in December of 1801, despite Louverture kind of getting the French questioning him, but not full on seeing him as a full on threat, that changes in December of that year, because by December of 1801, there's a certain man in power in France that we know very well. So well that he's not even worth a picture, because I think he's ingrained into the common eye. And that, of course, is Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte is rapidly becoming. He's not emperor yet. He hasn't crowned himself emperor of France yet, but he is pretty much the ruling man. And in December of 1801, Napoleon wants to kind of keep control of Saint Domingue because he's very much got this aspiration of maintaining some kind of a French presence in North America, and Saint Domingue is one of his key possessions. So he wants to kind of set an example that this lawlessness that's still seemingly going on and people there just calling the shots over the government, that is going to stop. I am reassuming control of the colony of Saint Domingue. So he's going to try to restore European rule instead of the rule being given to the affranchis and the former enslaved peoples. So he sends his brother-in-law, Napoleon sends his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, with an experienced force to the island colony. This would include Alexander Sabes Pétion and other exiled mulatto officers who had initially fled because they had been better off. Toussaint would struggle against the French forces for months upon Leclerc landing on Saint Domingue. He would eventually agree to an armistice in May of 1802, as he was rapidly not really gaining any major wins in his fights with the French. It was pretty much a stalemate. However, despite this armistice being drawn in May of 1802, and things could have ended there on a more peaceful manner, the French kind of do something that ends up backfiring in their face. And what they do is they break the agreement, arrest and imprison Toussaint, and they end up taking him back to France, deporting him back to France, putting him in prison there, where he would end up dying in prison on April 7th of 1803. This is going to cause a massive backfire effect for the French in Saint Domingue, because now with Louverture dead, his followers, who, mind you, were following the terms of the armistice, are going to realize France broke its word. They can't be trusted. Why would we trust them? They killed our leader. And that is going to cause immense problems for the French moving forward for over the next year. So here we'll show a couple of these images here. We have here, no, not that one yet. So here we have a depiction of the slave rebellion that was happening in 1791 in Haiti, where the slaves on it looks to be a sugarcane plantation. They are overthrowing and overpowering their white masters and even using cannons that they've commandeered. This is a depiction of what that might have possibly looked like. Of course, this would have been across the whole island, but this was a significant event in coming to the aid of the affranchis, the slaves formerly siding with the affranchis, and since they made up well over 90% of the population, it wasn't really all that surprising that a slave rebellion, if it happened on Saint Domingue, would actually be rather successful, and it was. And here we have a depiction of a painting of Haitian General Toussaint Louverture, who would be the main Haitian revolutionary leader up until his imprisonment and then death in about 1803 by the French after he'd already agreed to an armistice with them. He's the one that kind of kicks off Napoleon, kind of seeing that maybe if I don't reassert European control, this colony is going to kind of go off on its own way. So Napoleon tries to reassert his control and ends up having him killed. He's very much, I think, seen by the Haitians today as almost in the lines of how we Americans would see George Washington. He's very much viewed in the same way. And he was a former slave himself, as far as I'm aware. And here we have a painting of Napoleon's brother-in-law. This was General Leclerc, who was sent to kind of pacify and bring back European control over the kind of the renegade colony and kind of take away power from Toussaint and his former enslaved soldiers and his mulatto or affranchis soldiers. So this brings us to the second and final phase of the Haitian Revolution, is after Toussaint's death in April of 1803. Following his imprisonment, and actually in particular is when this happens, but following his imprisonment, some of his lieutenants would resume the war against France in 1802. Primarily, they would be led by two of his lieutenants in general. They would be led by Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Henry Christophe. And these two men had been Toussaint's main two lieutenants had been on his side. Also, they were joined, surprisingly, by Alexander Piton and his mulatto leaders who had at this point abandoned Leclerc, who they come across the ocean with, because they were angered by the caste restrictions that were being restored in the French military, and they no longer wanted to help Leclerc. They realized, well, why don't we throw our lot in with these rebels? Because they're like us. They're either black or they're affranchis. So why don't we throw our lot in with them? So you have also Pichen also coming in and helping Dessalines and Christophe. Both the blacks and the mulatto and the affranchis would be angered, especially, and fearful, because they're starting to get reports at this point of what Napoleon is doing across the former French Empire, and that is he is reestablishing slavery. He is reestablishing slavery and re-enslaving people that had been freed 10 years before by the revolutionary French government during the French Revolution. And most notably, this has already happened in France's other two major significant colonies in the North America, and that was at Guadeloupe and Martinique. They had already reestablished slavery there, and the fear was if the French reestablish control here in Saint Domingue, they will reestablish and send us all right back to the plantations and put us back as slaves. That drive of that fear of the reestablishment of slavery is going to drive these revolutionaries to fight. It is going to drive them to absolutely, under no circumstances, be willing to surrender to the French and be willing to let them have control of the colony. Them knowing that slavery would be reestablished if they failed was the main driving force during the second half of the revolution. Knowing that they could go right back to being slaves, if not. So France, however, despite its attempts, and this would surprise many because Napoleon, mind you, he's a great military strategist, but since he's not directly involved in this campaign, his army's floundering. France struggles to reestablish any sort of control over the renegade colony. They have an epidemic of yellow fever, which would kill many of their soldiers that had arrived there, including General Leclerc in May of 1802. In May of 1803, the final, somewhat semi-final nail in the coffin had been given when Napoleon agreed to sell to the United States the Louisiana Purchase in May of 1803, which pretty much signaled that Napoleon was already anticipating, I'm going to be going to war with all these European powers. I really don't have the means of protecting a French colony in the Americas, and Britain and Spain are very well versed there. So I don't want it because it's a liability at this point, but I don't want to give it to them either. So who can I give it to? Well, let's give it to the United States. The United States is a neutral party in this, and they're somewhat friendly with us. So I'd rather be giving it to them than to give it to our enemies. And because of that, it signals Napoleon's intent to withdraw from North America. The hostilities would also resume between France and Britain just a couple weeks after this on May 18th of that year of 1803. The final blow in the coffin for the French effort in Saint Domingue would come on November 18th of 1803 when Dessalines and his Armée Indignée, or indigenous army, would defeat the French at the Battle of Vertières. Excuse me. So what would happen was they would ambush the French army. It was pretty much, and the consequence of this was the French lost, and they lost control of their last major stronghold on the island. That was their last major military strong point that was worth holding. Once they lost that, there was nothing they could really do. The commanding general, who was actually Admiral de Rochambeau, who had been helping George Washington with the Yorktown campaign in 1783, he surrendered the last significant French stronghold at Cape Français, and the French were given 10 days to evacuate from the Cape Français, but since Rochambeau really didn't get in a big hurry, he kind of said, oh, I'm going to take what time I want to take. The Haitians kind of remind him, Dessalines kind of reminds him, he's like, oh no, we gave you terms, you lost to us. Either you get out in 10 days, or you see these cannons right behind me, I will aim them at your ships in the harbor, and I will fire. And you will be stranded here, and we will do God knows what with you. So here's your terms, sir. You will leave in 10 days, or I open fire. It was quite, he was basically negotiating from the position of strength. He knew that Rochambeau really couldn't do much because he had lost, and there wasn't much that he could say to counteract that. The problem was, it wasn't necessarily because Rochambeau was actually trying to delay his withdrawal. It was because since Britain was at war with France, Britain had blockaded Saint Domingue. They had blockaded Hispaniola, and because of that, French ships couldn't get through that blockade. So eventually, the people that actually come and evacuate the French forces from Cape Français was actually the British Royal Navy. They had actually come in and agreed to take the French forces out. France would officially leave Haiti, but remained in Santo Domingo until 1809. On January 1st of 1804, the whole island was declared officially independent from France under the indigenous name of Haiti. And most of the European powers would actually refuse to recognize Haiti after it officially declared its independence in 1804 because of the fact that it had been done through a successful slave revolt. Because they refused to recognize it because they feared that doing so, that recognizing the successful slave revolt would then cause other ones to spread to their countries and become successful. This was also somewhat the case in the United States, because the United States is kind of split at this point. You have the North that is becoming increasingly anti-slavery and actually abolishing slavery within the northern states, and then you have the South, the southern United States, which very much is entrenched in the slave system, and they absolutely fear a slave rebellion breaking out, and they're a powerful bloc in Congress at the time too. So the United States, despite it being a neighbor, and despite it being, you would think it'd be happy that a second country was declaring itself independent of European colonization. It doesn't extend recognition to Haiti until after the American Civil War, until after the slavery question within its own country has been answered, because of the fact that you have those Southerners. Because Southerners, they try to suppress any news to their slaves that there's been a successful slave rebellion down south in the Caribbean. And in the North, they want recognition for Haiti because the merchants in the North want to trade with Haiti. They want the money that can come through trade with this new neighbor. But that was the U.S. reaction in other European nations. Despite there was this new nation around, they were fearful to recognize it because of the fact that it had been established during a slave rebellion, and they feared what that could do to their own countries if they recognized it. In fact, with the United States, you can actually see, through the 3 presidential administrations that it took place in, you see a differing response. When it broke out, George Washington is president. George Washington is a slaveholder. He keeps the United States neutral and not involved. John Adams follows him. John Adams is a very big anti-slavery advocate for his time. And he loans arms, he loans money, he loans even a couple naval support to try to help these rebels in Haiti. And then you go back to Thomas Jefferson, where all that help will end because Jefferson himself was a slave owner. And that just shows you the attitude here in the U.S. So before we continue the aftermath here, so this is a portrait of Jean-Jacques Dessalines. He was basically the right-hand man, one of the two right-hand men for Toussaint Louverture, along with Henry Christophe. And he is going to be the primary leader during this rebellion against the French that finally kicked them off the island. And then he kind of does something here in the aftermath that's very questionable, but this was him. Then here we have the mulatto officer, or the affranchi officer of Alexander Pétion, who had kind of switched sides. He initially come over with General Leclerc, but then switched sides when they saw that the caste restrictions were being restored in the French military, and then sided with the Haitians for the rest of the conflict. And here's the depiction of the little battle at the very end of the Battle of Vertières, in which the French finally lost control of the island of Saint Domingue. So in the aftermath of Haiti's revolution, Dessalines does something very questionable almost from the start, and it's something that is kind of a dark part in Haitian history, and that is he orders an absolute massacre of any remaining white French colonists that remain on the island, with only a few exceptions. For example, I believe in one sector of the island there was a settlement of Germans, they were spared. There was a group of medical people, they were also spared. But in large part, almost any remaining French colonists on the island, Dessalines was encouraging basically a mass murder of anyone that was white on the island. And they did carry this out. Many white colonists that had remained in Haiti ended up being massacred by the government and by the local population in retribution for what Dessalines had called for all the injustices given to the native Haitian and Affranchis and the former slaves during the period of French colonization. So Dessalines would eventually crown himself Emperor Jacques I in October of 1804. And during his time, most of Haiti's population was actually destitute because of the fact that they had most of Haiti's population that remained were former slaves. They didn't have a whole lot of financial value. They hadn't inherited anything. So a lot of Haiti's population was actually quite poor. Dessalines was eventually killed in 1806 during a mulatto revolt, during trying to put down a revolt by the Affranchis. He was eventually killed. Haiti then went to a second attempt at monarchy, where Henry Christophe, who controls the northern half of Haiti under his loyalty, while Pétion would control the southern base at Port-au-Prince. And Christophe would declare himself King Henry I in 1811 and wage a civil war with Pétion for whoever was going to be the master of the island of Haiti. Now, Christophe did improve the economy of the Haitians, but he also forced former slaves to return to their plantations. So it kind of backtracking a little bit from what one of the main causes of the revolution had kind of been about. And he would also build the Palace of Sans-Souci and the fortress of La Citadelle La Frérière, where he would actually commit suicide due to an army mutiny in 1820. And that was Haiti's last time that they tried monarchy. After Christophe's death in 1820, the southern half of Haiti that was under Pétion's control, well, I think he actually died beforehand, but the republic that he had set up in the south would actually merge with that of the north, and Haiti would officially become a republic only after 1820. Initially, it was a monarchy. France, however, their old colonial master, France, as a last note here, France did not recognize Haiti's independence until 1825. Because after the Bourbons are restored, after Napoleon's defeat in 1815, they actually initially planned to try to reassert control. When this kind of leaked out to the world, France backed off on the measure, but they still weren't really willing to recognize Haiti. So eventually in 1825, they recognized Haiti's independence, but at the cost of 100 million francs. That they say, okay, you want us to recognize you? Fine, but you're going to pay us some money. That is Always Europeans and their money. Always Europeans and their money. At the cost of 100 million francs, Haiti bought France's recognition, and the repayment period would last until 1887 for Haiti to make up that money, which would also probably be a major contributor as to why Haiti has somewhat struggled through the years to maintain any kind of a good semblance of good government and good economy. And we'll look at that possibly in another video as to how Haiti has gotten to the state that it is today. But that concludes for this video. So that concludes for the Haitian Revolution. Again, very much overlooked by the French Revolution, but also significant. It is the only successful slave rebellion in history to create a nation state, to create a country. Though there were many ideas to do it, this was the only one that ever succeeded. And because of that, it's quite significant in world history, and it's kind of a shame that it gets overlooked. So if anyone has any comments or questions, feel free to put them in the comment section below, and I will get to them when I can. We will be back on next week. I don't know quite yet what it is, but I'm willing to take any suggestions if anyone has any. So feel free to do that if you have any. So that closes for this video. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, and we'll see you all back here next week for our next video.